Right now, commitment seems to be one of the key notions and issues that concern me philosophically. I could say my access to philosophy through my background, firstly as a musicologist, and then more broadly as a scholar or curator is, in a way, through this question of commitment that we want to speak of here. And this is not only my own professional narrative, but it seems almost inevitable to think about what we are committed to when we ask questions. I think when you start to make sense of something scholarly, you already presuppose a sort of commitment. You engage, to use another rendering of the term, and we know of the French engage or engagement, or the German uses the same rendering of the term, I think, as well. So philosophy in general is always engaged and committed, even if not explicitly recognizing this. I think of Socrates and his intervention into the public sphere as a really rigid and powerful political commitment. And both thinking and reflecting are also committed to a theory of knowledge. And we can also think of ontological commitment, that is about the presupposition that something is real in language, be it a theory, a subject, or an object. And I want to problematize this. And I don't want to outline the whole quote-unquote truth or system of how we should think of art and engagement exactly, but just to give an outline of how to be aware of this and why this could be important. So now our goal here is to speak of art and artistic commitment. So we will move towards this now. And this question of commitment in art, why? Why do we have this question? Should not art be something nominal exclusive of agendas? And doesn't it fail to be art if it's politically committed? And if we say so, I believe that we ascribe a certain autonomy to art. And this is one of the things that art has been considered to have for at least 200 years from now. So I think today we retain this sort of belief in the autonomy of art, but we must understand its limitations, and most importantly, its deceit. I think many of the thinkers in the last century were able to grasp that, through criticism of different doctrines of art theories, that an autonomous gesture is, in a way, to use a strong word, emancipating. But at the same time, it must be acknowledged that there is no autonomy. And the birth of artistic autonomy is at its core exactly its negation. And most prominently put by Adorno, its change in social function. So I think nowadays to question the political and aesthetic as possibly unconnected is in a way naive. The avant-garde movements haven't always been explicitly committed and didn't always have explicit political agendas. But if we look at their foundations, we can see that they actually did have political aims, or at least a political premise. And I'm thinking about any of them, be it surrealism, Dada, basically anything. The political premise, it seems, it was always there. And even when I think about Jonas Mekas, when he set off to make his films, and I have an offset replica of his early narrative film, the only one he's made, I think, Guns of the Trees. And the liner notes, in the liner notes he gives just, basic, or not maybe basic, but general thoughts on why is he making film. And I think his motives that he outlines there are actually quite explicitly aiming at the political gesture. So I will quote now. "My anger is not for sale. My anger is here to do some work. After all, every poet is dangerous. After all, every poet wants to change the status quo of man's spirit, to wake up his consciousness, even if, in order to achieve it, he has to overthrow the government. Is there a government today in any country that is not going against the consciousness of man?" End quote. And I find similar thoughts in the diaries of the time. I mean, his diaries. And his engagement there is not trying to offer a recipe. And he makes it clear he is recognizing the problems in the political realm, which speaks of the conditions in which the artwork is made and in which the artwork is conceived. Thus, we can speak of its immanence, its embeddedness in the conditions it is in. Its autonomy appears to be deceit, but at the same time, and this is as close to what I think Adorno had in mind when he said it's a possibility. So now I'll move to more contemporary practices, which I think are characteristic of what I'm speaking. And I think commitment is always born in a sort of social and political context or a regime. And it is through this connection that a piece can actually radicalize itself and it can gain a function. Well, it can function in that way. And the reflection on its conditions and immanence makes it like that by design. I would even go as far as to say that a piece is always truthful, because its falsity is also true. Therefore, a propagandistic piece is also a product of its time and social context and can tell us a lot about the political realm. And on the other hand, taking reality and presenting it in a certain way can highlight tensions otherwise shrouded by ideology. And I'm thinking about one not widely known early electronic piece by late composer Faustas Latėnas from 1983 called Musa Memoria. It uses words of mentally ill people along with poetry by Sigitas Geda. And this is the idea that I think we are working with too. That piece can be dismissed at its time and also leave a trace. It can complicate the perpetuation of the discourse and of the current politics. And yet, do you think of it as a committed work? And I think yes, in a very deep sense. The deepest critique is akin to aim at the very conditions that give birth to it, because they are always a false consciousness. So I started to think about this and do research quite a long time ago, and I realized that the embeddedness of the work in the system is, on the one hand, inevitable and can be accessed and quite clearly seen in something that is affecting and evoking criticism. So it was back in 2016 I became very interested in the work of Johannes Keiler, who is primarily a composer, but in his works he's using an extended definition of music, which entails its semantics and its means of how it is made, its infrastructure in which it functions. Yeah, and basically everything in which music today operates. And I interviewed him, and among other things, I asked him about the political agenda of his art and of art in general. And his answers struck me as deeply insightful. The piece that rose quite an interest of the media and the public dealt with situations that expressed the problems through the lens of the artist, because she, or in this case he, is an insider of the political. So his piece, Product Placements, is about 30 seconds long, but it uses 70,000 samples from other artists. So he had to register all that samples that he used with GEMA, which is a German Association of Artistic Rights and Mechanical Reproduction, or something like that. So yeah, and the process of him actually turning in all these blank sheets became sort of another piece and another point of critique in itself. And I think the problem that emerged for him as an artist, that he had to do this, and it came up because he was, in his words, an insider of the system which made him stretch it and articulate it in an artistic manner. Similarly, his other work from that time, outsourcing, problematizing cheap labor force that is outsourced somewhere else. But I was interested in another piece, which might seem naive at the first glance, but I think it raised even more critical points about art and about commitment. And it was from 2008, and it's called Charts Music. And it uses stock market charts from the crisis of that year. And it's juxtaposed with ridiculously childish music production software by Microsoft. And I think it managed to sort of cognitively relate data, which uses marginal utility, effectiveness, efficiency, something which is deeply neoliberal, and it kind of made us, or anyone who viewed the piece, to face neoliberal reality by making its own alienating form of representation resonate. So even more so when the graphs like dead GIs in Iraq or porn industry growth appear just after Lehman Brothers or what was General Motors and all the other big companies that crashed in 2008. So there are other ways to engage with art and reality and make art speak of something. And one of the pieces that I have in mind when I think of this sort of commitment is by Alex Arteaga, who is a Berlin-based sound artist and researcher. And his early piece, which I remember quite vividly, an art installation, which was in Singur Gallery, which doesn't exist anymore in Berlin. It's called Surb Wassersprache, and it was already exploring our relation to the world through artistic means. The assumption that it is based on is that the urban space is not a given entity conceived by someone else, but is only generated and emerges through interaction of the perceiving subject with her or his surroundings. So the piece is part of the artist's broader research, which uses enactivism as a sort of basis of what he's doing. And I think his work would be counterpointed with some earlier examples, and I think of some examples not even from the art sphere, but like Tony Schwartz from 1950s, who was just recording people with his recorder in New York. It's called Nueva York, but it manages to show how I think subjects actually constitute spaces that they live in. And we can also think of Murray Schafer's famous soundscape discourse, which he launched, and now it's also, our perception and what we hear is also part of what we perceive in the space, if that makes any sense. So I have two more thoughts that I want to give. One is forensic architecture, which is now a very prominent research group, and I think one of the most important phenomena functioning in galleries today. But I'm not even sure how should we classify it, because I think by all means is one of the most important phenomena today. But it's sort of symptomatic that it shows that you have to use art's infrastructure to relate to some problems in the world. And it doesn't lend itself to art criticism, I think, because it actually functions with facts and kind of pushes away the ambivalence and absorption, but its representation is still intertwined with aesthetics. So you can do aesthetic criticism of their work. So why I'm mentioning this, I think it's a deeply committed, actually, enterprise to do research and present it in art spaces worldwide. But it also goes beyond, I think, and maybe actually loses something which art as a committed phenomenon can actually show us. And maybe lastly, and I think it will be something to conclude with, is the problem of representation and effectiveness of commitment when we think of climate change and ecology. Because on the one hand we are always the insiders of this issue, and I'm thinking about the ways how it can be committed and also productive. And I only have an example which I always use to criticize, which is Edward Burtynsky and his photography, which has a very pronounced political commitment and goals, but actually just perpetuates the gaze towards nature as a sublime entity, but also kind of fosters fascination with technology and extraction of fossil fuels. But even here, I think where aesthetic representation fails at the goal it has set for itself, it can help us highlight the philosophical problem and the debates between different schools of thought, like new materialism or critical realism. So I think commitment is unavoidable and illuminating, we want it or not.